which is in place at Metcalf and also at the junior and senior high school, has units on anti-bullying as well. At the junior high school started something this year called the One School, One Book initiative, and that is a book that faculty members read. And the faculty members read it in the summer so that they could get together and start preparing lessons around the themes of that book with their advisories, and the students are reading that book as well. The book is called Wonder, and it deals with topics of anti-bullying, friendships, families, relationships, and so forth. So they have developed quite a few advisory lessons, all related to that One School, One Book initiative. So they've really taken a very structured approach to the topic this year. Also, the guidance counselor has done a survey. It was very recent, but she has done a survey for students asking for some feedback so we could identify areas of concern and areas of need, and then we could plan accordingly to address some of those concerns. So pretty intensive stuff going on.
That's great. All set. Any other questions for Jim?
Good.
Thank you so much. That was informative. Okay, now we have the Seascape contract. Actually, it's Sitescapes, right? Took over Seascapes.
Yes. So this is the same exact work that Seascape has done for us over the past several years. It is a budgeted expense, and Bob has provided for you a pretty comprehensive review of the tasks that Seascape has performed in the past. There's really no change to what they have done for us over the past several years.
Make a motion to accept. Second.
Can we, let's, Lee, do you mind just adding to it the motion to renew the grounds maintenance as proposed by Sitescapes for the next 2 years for the price lock agreement of $35,430? Thank you. Second. Thank you.
Make a motion to accept the new Sitescapes grounds landscape contract for the next 2 years. This is 2 years, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Yep. Okay. The October 1st enrollment.
This is the preliminary count. We provide this each year as of October 1st, which is the magic date that is identified in our charter. This represents the percentage of children residing in the towns of Exeter and West Greenwich. I do not have what last year's numbers look like at this time, but I usually provide those when we start the budgeting process so that you can see how it compares and how it translates into a shifting of funds based on the shifted enrollment. But we are getting closer to the 50-50 mark, which it's a trend that we've seen over the past several years. We're continuing in that direction. Again, these are preliminary. They have been provided to the towns. I have already heard from West Greenwich. Very few questions this year at this point. And actually the questions, I spoke directly with Kevin Breen. The questions were ones that I could answer over the phone with him. Pretty simple.
Excellent. Good. And that there's all set, you said, right? They're all set with their numbers.
I haven't heard anything from them. They if they have questions, they will contact me, but typically The areas that cause the greatest concern are areas in West Greenwich. It has to do with certain locations that are very migrant. But we've made some changes in our enrollment process, so I require leases from some of those apartments that have a start and an end date and a listing of all the children that reside in that particular apartment. That's included right on the front page of the lease. So typically that's what the West Greenwich town wants. And when I first got here, we needed to track all of those leases down, but now we make that part of the registration. So I just keep copies. Every secretary faxes me the lease as they come in. I just keep a copy, and then when the enrollment numbers go over, I ship copies of the leases with them. So it avoids 85% of the questions that they typically have.
Any questions? Okay.
When we talk about the capital.
Okay, we have policies review, amendment, adoption, deletion, policy 8506.
Okay. This came out of some recent conversations, and you'll notice that paperclip to policy 8506 is policy 8509. 8509 is provided as a reference only, but 8506 has been amended to clarify a perceived inconsistency with policy 8509, and the adjustment is located on pages 5 and 6. 8509 and 8506 with this amendment now have the exact same language. It basically talks about when law enforcement officers are notified, and that clause, law enforcement officers shall be notified. Principal shall notify law enforcement officers in all cases involving illicit drugs other than marijuana. However, law enforcement officers shall be notified when a student is found in possession of marijuana with intent to sell, evidenced by possession of 3 or more small wrap packages or a bulk quantity of 1 or more ounces of the unlawful substance. That is consistent. That language is consistent with the law because that 1 ounce mark is really what distinguishes a civil offense from a criminal charge. And in one of our policies, it didn't have that stipulation. It was everybody, in all cases, law enforcement would be involved. In the other policy, law enforcement does not need to be involved. And it's really to be consistent with one of the other policies that we talked about, giving some flexibility to provide alternative discipline for children if it's their first offense, and if they cooperate with the investigation, and really an opportunity for us to provide some help and support as needed to children. So this is just a change that was requested, went through the policy subcommittee to make the 2 policies read exactly the same way.
Any questions? Okay. We can pass this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are the 2 policies. Well, E and F are all amendments, so amendments can be adopted with one read.
Okay. So let's do one at a time. So if we can have a motion to approve the amendment to policy 8506. Second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Abstentions? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Then we have
8607. 8607 is participation in extracurricular activities, and this amendment really has to do with eligibility for homeschool students. This is not connected to the previous vote that was just taken. Basically, we had a request last month for a homeschool child to participate in an extracurricular event at one of our schools, and I know that there was some there was some discussion, and the decision was made at the school level not to allow the student to attend. After some discussions and some research, I did go onto the RIDE website to look for their guidance. RIDE does recommend that schools allow homeschool students to participate in a wide range of activities. And basically the distinction here is that a homeschool child is actually approved by school committee. So they must submit their entire homeschool program through my office, and I have to approve it, making sure that they're compliant with all of the applicable laws. There is also a requirement for annual reporting and so forth. So basically, homeschool children live in our community, and their program, even though we don't provide it directly, their program is approved through school committee action. So the feeling of RIDE is that they really are a part of the school community, and they encourage districts, not require, but encourage districts to allow children to participate in a range of activities. Athletics is easy because the rules for athletics are covered by the Interscholastic League or the Principals Committee on Athletics. This was really about other extracurricular activities, the band, chorus, after-school clubs, dances, so forth. So this policy basically adds a section around the eligibility requirements for homeschool students, saying that they are able to participate as long as they they reside in the district and they are in an approved homeschool program, which means that it's in accordance with policy 7505. And they must also, in order for them to participate, they must go to the school office, and they must have on file an emergency contact information card, just so that if there is anything that happens, we have the same information for emergency contact as all other children. In addition, they are required to meet all of the eligibility standards, including the conduct standards. They are not required to meet the specific academic requirements outlined in this policy because their requirements are outlined in policy 7505. So this policy says they must meet the academic and reporting requirements outlined in our homeschooling policy. In the reporting requirements, the reason that that's in there is we get great information at the beginning of the year for families who wish to homeschool their children. They provide the program, it gets approved. We typically, in about maybe half of the cases, have to send out multiple letters to get the end of year report, which is also a requirement. And so we figured that this would be a way, if somebody wants to participate, they need to be in good standing with the reporting requirements as well. It would be a way for us to get that in to the district, and Robin handles all of that tracking for us. So it's pretty easy change, but it is consistent with the recommendations of the Rhode Island Department of Education with respect to homeschool children. That's the only change on this policy.
Any questions?
I have a question. So I realize that what you're saying is this wouldn't be athletic involvement, but participation in other activities.
Yeah. Athletic involvement is already covered because
Right.
those rules are separate.
So I would assume that they're not subject to the suspension and expulsion policies that
Correct.
we just discussed, but in terms of behavior on school grounds and during school events, would they still be subject to those restrictions?
Yes, so that's in here, required to meet the eligibility standards required of Exeter West Greenwich students, including proper conduct at activities, listed right in here.
Thank
That's the conformance with policy paragraph, the very last one that's in red.
You got a question?
Thank you.
This one, no.
Okay.
I'll make a motion to accept the Ewgsc assessment.
I'll second it.
I have one more question, too.
One
Go
more
ahead.
question. In terms of things like prom, and if you're bringing someone from out of town, there's a requirement to have some kind of paperwork filled out. Is that still
Yes.
enforced
Yes.
under this policy?
Because they must meet all of the requirements of
So that's-
our Exeter West Greenwich students,
Okay.
yes.
All right, thank you.
And a homeschool child, for example, at the high school, junior prom, senior prom, we've had homeschool children attend because of the dates of some of our students that attend here. And they're still required to provide whatever the documentation is from their home school, which is their parent in that case. This would allow them to go anyway.
Not thinking of the date from out of town.
Yeah, they would still need to provide the same documentation that we ask of all children who attend our school who bring a date from out of town.
Good, thank you.
I have one question. And Sue might better answer this because it's an administrative thing. The form that we have to, the parents have to sign, the permission form, it has the breathalyzer information. How does that get to the homeschool parent?
Well, I can answer that. The way that we address that is under enrollment, parents must appear in person at the school office appropriate to the age of the student and complete the emergency contact information card. They basically are coming to the office to say, I'm filling out this form, my child is wishing to attend whatever the dance, the activity. Since the parent is required to go to the office to indicate that they're coming, then they would receive all of the required paperwork, documentation, and so forth.
I just know it kind of comes home separate at a different time. Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Alrighty. The athletic handbook revision.
Okay, the athletic handbook revision, the section is on page 3. The page numbers will appear after the final copy is done because with the crossouts and the added, it moved all the page numbers below. But once it's fixed, if it passes as is and the crossout is removed, all the page numbers will slide back up and it'll be fine. But again, this is a discussion that came out of some recent events, and it has to do with the policy that we previously approved the amendment for, 8506, suspension and expulsion. In that policy, for first-time offenders in certain cases involving marijuana, paraphernalia, that does not rise to the level of a criminal offense, but more of a civil violation. The school committee policy is that there is some flexibility in terms of determining what an appropriate consequence is for children. The feeling was that having that flexibility, which was a good thing, and then when you look at the athletic handbook, it was cut and dry about being removed from a team for the entirety of the season. So there was some discussion and a request for all of these to go to policy subcommittee, which they did. So the recommendation was for any student athlete who is a first-time violator of that policy and who is eligible for discipline other than suspension. So in other words, if it's illicit drugs other than marijuana, they're not eligible for alternative suspension. If they have an ounce or more, or there's intent to sell, they're not eligible for an alternative to suspension. So it's very few cases, but in the event that they're eligible for an alternative, the feeling was, let's have a discussion about an alternative to a removal from the team for the entirety of the season. So this basically says that a first-time offense for a child who is eligible for an alternative to suspension would receive a 10-day removal from the team. And if it's a second offense or a first-time offense for somebody that's not eligible for an alternative, then they're removed from the team for the entirety of the season. And the feeling was that having a policy that provided some flexibility on one hand and a handbook that provided no flexibility on the other hand was something that people wanted to explore and have a deeper conversation about. So I'm not exactly sure where this discussion will lead, but it's on the table, and open for discussion.
Well, my only concern, and I think what you've done here is fine. Everything now is consistent. My only concern is, what about off-season, out-of-season violations? There has to be some ramification. It can't be, we have to behave while it's in season, but we don't have to behave, and there's no consequence for it when it's off-season. It has to be consistent. It has to be applicable to the entire school year, as far as this is concerned, and as far as I'm concerned.
Let's go over some scenarios.
Yeah, that conversation has been happening from what I understand before my arrival here, because this language about removal from the team has been part of the handbook for many years. And because of some recent discussions, there's been a request to bring the conversation back. But I think the struggle is, for example, if a child gets caught, let's use a kid who's eligible for an alternative, and a child gets caught with paraphernalia, it doesn't rise to the level of a criminal offense, and it happens between the fall season and the winter season. And we say you're suspended for 10 days from your next season. Suppose the child also plays basketball. So if you're suspended for 10 days, you are suspended from tryouts, which basically implies that you don't try out, you don't make the team. That's how most coaches operate. So it basically implies that you would lose the whole season. The other scenario is that same event, but a child is not eligible for an alternative. So that if you say that they'll lose the next season, well, if it is a child who plays a fall sport and a spring sport, and typically doesn't play a winter sport, and we say you lose your next season. The child says, well, I planned on trying out for basketball, so that's the season I'm losing. Then we have no way of identifying whether that was real or whether it was just, I'm saying that I want to lose the winter sport so that's my season off, and I'm going to play the sport that I would have played anyway. So those were a couple of scenarios, because people have had this conversation, but they've really struggled with, and I haven't really thought about it long enough to come to grips with an alternative, but I do recognize that it's not quite as simple as even what I originally thought. Once you start thinking through some of the scenarios and the timelines of events, it becomes complicated. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I just don't know the answer.
What I would add to that is, a student is only an athlete if they are participating, or at least in my mind. They're a student athlete if they're participating currently in baseball, currently in football. They're not a student athlete if they played one session and they never plan to play again, or if they have not been an athlete on any of our teams yet. So the way I look at this is, you're a student athlete if you're currently playing a sport. Whether it's, whether the offense happens off-season, you're not considered a student athlete. You're a student athlete if the offense happens during your athletic experience, is the way I look at it. So I agree. I don't think I could make this any more broad to say, it encompasses any time a student plays for a team. That's how I look at it, at least.
Carrie. Oh, I thought you had a question.
Oh, sure. Have the athletic director or any of the coaches been included in any discussion about the proposed amendment?
I have had a conversation with the athletic director, and he's basically going to follow whatever the policy states. I did have some conversations with with some coaches about the rationale behind the statement that you're removed from your current team. But if a child gets caught in between seasons, why it doesn't apply to the next season, and that's where I got some of those scenarios from. It made me think, I understand now why it becomes so complicated. And this isn't something that has occurred very frequently in our district.
I was concerned about the coaches and the athletic director because, you know, they are responsible for the conduct and the safety of their players. And I would think that they would want some input as to what their status is when they take the field, or they're at a practice, or they're off our grounds at a visiting situation.
And I think, just to clarify, there's a difference between school committee rules and a coach's decisions around who is on his or her team. Coaches have wide leeway and wide flexibility in selecting and maintaining their rosters. And while some coaches are very clear with students that it doesn't matter, their expectations are there will be none of this kind of activity on this team. Other coaches are more inclined to go with policy. It's like the tryouts. People look for different things in tryouts. We don't tell coaches what they should be looking for during tryouts. So I think that coaches still have flexibility, but the rule right now, it's really, the way that it's written currently, it's imposed as opposed to a team decision. That's the way I look at it.
As far as in-season and off-season discipline, how are academic failures considered? If they're off-season, where does that come into play? I'm just trying to balance the two against each other.
All of the academic requirements are outlined in the eligibility policy that we just looked at, but it is also consistent with Rhode Island Interscholastic League and Rhode Island Principals Committee on Athletics, those regulations. And it all relates back to the most recent report card. So whatever the last issued report card is what's used to match the student's academic standing against the requirements of the policy, which are consistent with the Interscholastic League rules. And if a student is not eligible for a portion of the season and a new report card is issued and they become eligible, then they can go back on the team. And sometimes it works to their advantage and sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes they're off for the first part of the season and they miss tryouts, and the coach says, you miss tryouts, you don't make the team, because I have kids that did try out and didn't make the team, I can't take you. And then sometimes they're on the team and they get removed. I mean, it all depends on when that report card is issued.
And how is that any different? I agree that there may be some complications, but why can't we figure out logistically how to handle that in a disciplinary event? Because I think that's just as critical.
I agree. I just don't know the answer at this point. I can think about it some more. I mean, if this is okay and you decide that this is something that you want to adopt, then you can do so. And if we go back to the table with that issue to consider, think about, then we can come back at a different time with some recommendations. I just don't know the answer right now off the top of my head.
I'm fine with that alternative, but I think that it's something that needs to be addressed.
I like the changes in the policy. I don't think any situation should be cut and dried. I think there should always be some ability to look at circumstances and to have some leeway and some professional judgment involved. So I like the policy, and I would like to make a motion to approve the change in the policy.
Second. Further discussion.
So I've said this in the past, I'll say it again. I hold our student athletes above other students, and I don't agree with giving them an out. I just don't. And I think it is black and white, because when a student comes to school, they know if they're going to try out for a team. So right away they're a student athlete, and that's the way I look at it. So I can't agree. I just can't. I know other schools do it for whatever reasons they do it. I just don't think that we need to, within a season, a year, give a second chance, because this is not an accident when this happens. These are these are violations that are thought through, and so I just don't think we should be given a second chance. However, if it is approved, which I will not vote for, but I believe there's an error here, when you say a period of 10 school days, if that spans a holiday week, then it's 3 weeks. So I think you want to give this calendar days, not school days,
Because sports don't end.
there's a crossover, I believe, in the winter sports.
Yeah.
So you've got to be careful that So I would suggest, if it's approved, that it go to calendar days, not school days. But I'm not going to vote in favor of this.
Calendar days, so it includes the weekends, regular calendar days?
Yes,
school
they're
calendar?
like 14 instead of 10 or something like that.
So 14 calendar days.
Calendar days, that way it's even.
It might be sports calendar days.
I was thinking the same thing, sports calendar.
Sports calendar days. Because it could be 10 school days, or during Mark's point, during the winter and spring, you wind up during the vacation times, there's sports activities going on. So.
Okay.
My discussion is I'm okay with this as long as what we've talked about goes back to policy committee for future consideration. I mean, it makes everything consistent.
Yeah, we'll readdress it after some research is done.
Okay.
Just let everybody know how I stand on it. I agree with Mark. I hold our student athletes to a very high standard. I had a hard time grappling this whole issue. I erred on the side of it's a child that we're dealing with, and they make mistakes. I think we've probably all made mistakes in our life, and we learn from them. So since we're dealing with kids, that's kind of where I fell with the whole issue. And also, it is a first-time violator, cooperates. It's in very limited circumstances. So just so everybody knows where I stand on the whole thing. Okay. We're ready to vote. Everybody else set? Okay. We have a motion. We have a second. Okay. All in favor of let's say the revised amendments to the EWG Athletic Handbook 2015-16 version?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Margaret, Terry. Robin, you're good? Okay. Abstentions? Okay. Motion carries. Okay. We have next.
Claudia, can I ask a question?
Yes.
If any, before the revision of the old policy, if anyone was negatively impacted by that policy, does that change?
Turn it over to our superintendent.
I mean, it's a tricky situation, but typically, if a change is made in the policy, it's because we've recognized that, or the committee has approved a change because what was previously written was not working. So I would think that a student who was negatively impacted would have to meet the new requirements. So if they're if they would have met the 14 calendar day, or when they meet the 14 calendar day, that they would be eligible for a return. That's what I would think.
Okay.
Yeah, because it could be the opposite too. So.
Right.
Right.
No, I agree.
Okay. We have unfinished business, the reserve capital project update. And then in this discussion, that handout Robin gave on from Mr. Ross is going to be applicable.
So in the original packet, on the back of the form for the agenda item is a letter from RIDE that was addressed to me indicating that they have received our intent for the fast track repair program that's been talked about at our previous meeting. The contract for phase 1 to 4 is $60,000 for architect and engineering services. And then this is just it's consistent. This letter that Bob provided after is consistent with the language that's on the front page of this form. It's to approve the architect and engineering services which are required in order for us to go forward with the fast track program. Remember, the fast track program is a reimbursable and it's a high rate of reimbursement. So we want to try to get as much as we can approved through that process so we get the highest reimbursement rate, and then those funds can be turned around and used for additional capital projects in the future.
Question: will we only incur the costs of that expenditure as they occur, as we assign tasks as a building committee, or do we pay that money as like in?
I believe that the original service is a district-wide review of all things capital. Because while we have our initial list of activities, capital projects, we want to make sure that we haven't missed anything. So the contractor would come in and do an analysis district-wide of all buildings, all structures, to make sure that if there are needs that we've not already identified, that they become part of the mix. And then we get their approval for our submission to RIDE from that point. So I think it's representative of a district-wide analysis, which I think will provide good information for us regardless of what direction we go.
Okay.
Is the $60,000 also reimbursable?
I don't believe the $60,000 is reimbursable,
That's
but the actual projects are. Yes.
Any further questions? Okay. If we could have the motion, as Bob stated on his handout that he gave us, because I do want to make it subject to the completion of the contract review by legal.
I move that upon completion of the contract review by the district legal counsel, the school committee approve the funding for the architectural feasibility study for $60,000 with the work to be performed by Toronto Architects.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? Motion carries. We have reports and comments. Did you have anything else on the capital you want to talk about?
No, we're still in the middle of our audit. So once we have the final audited amount from June 30th of the previous year, I'll fill in that spreadsheet. We can have some discussions about the next projects that we want to invest in.
All right. Reports and comments. Have anything? Okay. Important dates. We have our next two school committee meetings.
I won't be present for the meeting on the November 24th, so I just wanted to let you know in case that becomes a quorum issue.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Do we do one, two, three?
Under the
Okay.
Make a motion to go into executive session under Article D 42, 46, 5, security.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion